Who's this? And what is happening to Rosa Parks? Yes, this is her arrest. For refusing to give up her seat for a white man. November 13th, 1956. The Supreme Court of the United States ruled, not everybody shares this history, so I want to be sure we know it. The Supreme Court upheld basically the ruling of a lower court that segregation in transportation, as it was practiced not only in Montgomery but in the state of Alabama and throughout the South, was unconstitutional. Right? And that happened because of the Montgomery boycott, which was the first real effort of what was the new civil rights movement in the United States. And the Montgomery boycott was led by Dr. King. Now, the reaction to that Supreme Court ruling was immediate and utterly sadistic by white supremacists in the South. And so Dr. King wanted to make it very clear what that boycott was really about, because the goal of the boycott was more than a bus ride. It was even more than ending segregation. That boycott was the means to an end, and Dr. King said this: the end. Oh, we're missing a slide now, Jean. Let me read it to you. The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of understanding goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men. It wasn't enough to just achieve equity. Dr. King's confidence and faith in the moral arc of the universe called his heart to seek reconciliation. That's a whole other thing, isn't it? It's a new relationship and redemption. God's healing for this nation and the world. Well, the diplomacy arc over the last several weeks has been startling, particularly between North and South Korea and the United States. And I'll tell you, I don't know whether I should hold my breath. But I do know that Korean hearts are longing for more than just a peace accord. They're longing for even more than denuclearization. They are longing for the reconciliation of families, of a culture, of a history that has been shredded by ideological violence. They're hoping for more than forgiveness. What is it that turns human hearts to stone? What is it? Pardon? Oh, where are you? Hatred? Mistrust? Lies? Ignorance? What was that? Hurt feelings? Fear? Ignorance? brutality, physical violence. There's all kinds of things you can do to a human heart, can't you? To turn it from what it was meant to be into something else. And so maybe forgiveness isn't enough. It's a lot to ask, isn't it, sometimes? But maybe it's not enough. God's people had been hauled off into exile because they had sidled up to other nations, and they had forgotten their covenant to care for one another, and especially to care for the foreigners who were among them with God's hospitality. And so God wanted a word with God's people yet again. And through the prophet Ezekiel, God basically sent this message. You know, you people are supposed to be reflecting my holiness to all the nations around you. And now you're in those nations in exile, and all you're doing is giving me a bad name because of your bad behavior. But, I'm going to let you start again. And I'm going to sprinkle you clean. And I'm going to redeem this covenant that you have trashed. And I'm going to restore you to the land where you can prosper. And I'm going to reconcile you to the one another, to the creation that you abuse, to one another, to the nations, and to me. How far God goes. Our God doesn't stop at forgiveness. Let me tell you a story. It was the night before Palm Sunday in 1990, and the Bishop family had gathered at a local restaurant in Winnetka, Illinois. Anybody know where that is? A little north of Chicago, yes, Winnetka, Illinois. And they all gathered in the parking lot, kissing and hugging, saying goodbye, and they were celebrating because Nancy was expecting her first child. It's a big celebration. And as they were saying goodbye with one another, Sister Jean hugged her sister Nancy and said, "I'll see you tomorrow after church." Now, Jean was in the choir. It was Palm Sunday, and they were walking up the aisle when an usher came and took her arm and said, "There's a call for you." She's like, "This is crazy. It's Palm Sunday. Can you take a message?" And the usher said, "No, you need to come with me." So you know how those moments are and your heart starts to race, and she was thinking of her elderly parents, but it was her dad on the phone. And he said, "Jean, someone has killed Nancy. Someone has killed them both." "What do you mean, someone killed Nancy and Richard?" And Jean says, "That was the moment evil intruded on my life." That's a moment. 6 months later, when the police arrested the perpetrator, they were shocked to learn that it was a 16-year-old junior from the high school who'd gotten himself a .365 Magnum and sat in the house and waited, broke into the house and waited for them to come home. And he knew that because apparently Richard had begged for her life, he knew Nancy was pregnant. And after he shot Richard, he shot Nancy 3 times in the belly. And so when he was convicted, the judge decided that was heinous and deserved extra punishment, and so he sent the killer to jail for life without parole. 16-year-old boy. And Nancy decided two things in this time of trauma for herself and her family. She decided that she wanted to live a life worthy of the life her 25-year-old sister would not have. And she also wanted to change the fact that the United States at that time was the only Western government that gave sentences to minors of life without parole. And so she began to be an activist, and she changed her profession from corporate law to public defender. And her life began to be filled with very, very troubled lives. Now, at the very beginning of this ordeal, Jean, she was Presbyterian, by the way. She is Presbyterian. Jean knew that she was going to reject hate. She knew that she could not be a follower of Jesus and hate even the killer of her sister. And so she rejected hate, but she remembered a quote she got from somewhere. Hate is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. So she knew that she didn't want her life consumed with hatred, and so she faced that idea of forgiving her sister's killer. And she forgave him. She prayed at her sister's grave, and she asked God to take all hate from her heart, and she forgave him. And so she began in this new life of Christian activism to do a lot of speaking engagements, particularly to Christian groups and other attorneys, advocating for the end of sentencing of minors to life without parole and also the death penalty. And as she continued this life, her activism brought her into contact with other Christian attorneys, and one in particular was a book written by Reverend Dr. Randall O'Brien, who at the time was the provost of the Baylor University and a theology professor there. And he wrote a book on forgiveness and healing and freedom from a Christian perspective. And she read this book and she was loving it until she got to one sentence that brought her new life to a screeching halt. And this is that sentence. No Christian man or woman is relieved of the obligation, strong word, to reconcile with those who have wronged them. You've been wronged, it's on you, if you're a Christian, to reconcile with the one who has wronged you. She read that, and she was enraged. I have already forgiven this man. This man who never took responsibility, never admitted the crime, never showed remorse, never said anything to all the people he had traumatized by taking those lives. She's a fighter, so she called O'Brien to challenge him on his sentence. And she said, so what would that look like? And he said, it would look like Jesus on the cross. And so Jean realized that for 20 years, she had been going around the country telling everyone that she had forgiven her sister's killer, and she had never told him. And she had never even used his name. And so that weighed in her heart. And she finally decided she would reach out And again, she went to her sister's grave, opened her heart, and said, God, do something with this. And so she wrote a letter. And she writes, I'll go first. I am sorry. Can you imagine writing a letter to your sister's killer and saying, I am sorry that I have not told you all these years that I have forgiven you for the murder of my sister and my brother-in-law. And she waited, wondering if she'd ever hear anything. She got a letter. And the letter said, I know that you have been waiting all this time to hear this. I won't make you wait any longer. I am guilty. What followed those two letters, Jean would tell you, is a story of redemption and reconciliation for both of them. For Jean Bishop and David Bureau. And Jean is still advocating for his release on parole. And they meet and talk regularly. Brothers and sisters, we have been sprinkled. We have been sprinkled with that same love that has the power to transform enemies into brothers and sisters, more than friends. Ours is a God who doesn't stop at forgiveness, but whose power and whose work brings us into right relationship with God and one another again. So let me invite you to pray this week about a place, someone where you have offered forgiveness, that God might turn into reconciliation if only your heart were to be soft enough to allow God to soften your heart. We have been sprinkled. We have been cleansed. And we are free. Let me invite you to remember that amazing grace that has very real power in our lives and here in the life of the world as you prepare your offering to this God who doesn't stop at forgiveness.